The Israeli-Palestinian conflict did not begin thousands of years ago. It began in its modern form in the late 19th century, when two nationalist movements began to lay claim to the same land. One was Zionism, a Jewish nationalist movement born in Europe in the late 1800s, amid waves of anti-Semitism, pogroms, and exclusion. Led by figures like Theodor Herzl, Zionists believed the Jewish people needed a state of their own, and many pointed to Palestine, then part of the Ottoman Empire, as the ancestral and rightful homeland. The other was emerging Palestinian nationalism, shaped by centuries of Arab and Islamic history, and by increasing awareness that foreign powers, including Zionist settlers and European empires, sought control over their land. At the time, Palestine was home to roughly 500,000 people, 90% of whom were Arab Muslims and Christians, and about 10% were Jews, many of them local and religiously observant, not nationalist in outlook. In the 1880s, European Zionists began immigrating and buying land, often displacing Arab tenant farmers. From 1882 to 1914, tens of thousands of Jews arrived in waves of migration known as aliyot. While some Palestinian Arabs welcomed them as neighbors, others began to resist what they saw as a colonial settler movement. During this time, the Ottoman Empire was in decline, and World War I reshaped the Middle East. Britain, seeking Arab support against the Ottomans, made conflicting promises. To the Arabs, it promised independence after the war. To the Zionists, it promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration of 1917. These contradictions planted the seeds of future violence. The Palestinians were never consulted. They didn't believe their homeland was Britain's to give away. When British and Zionist officials entered Jerusalem in 1917, Palestinian resistance was still largely political, but it was clear that two groups, Zionist Jews and native Palestinian Arabs, had begun a zero-sum conflict over land, identity, and sovereignty. The global powers had redrawn borders. The people in Palestine had no say. After World War I, the League of Nations granted Britain a mandate to govern Palestine. The British Mandate, which began in 1922, marked a critical turning point. Jewish immigration accelerated under British protection, and Zionist institutions were formalized. Palestinians, who had hoped for independence, found themselves under foreign rule and facing a growing settler population backed by imperial powers. The 1920s and 30s were marked by tension and bloodshed. In 1920 and 1929, violent riots broke out in Jerusalem and Hebron, resulting in deaths on both sides. The cause: growing anxiety over land purchases, immigration, and access to religious sites. In 1936, Palestinians launched a national uprising, the Arab Revolt, demanding independence and an end to mass Jewish immigration. It lasted 3 years and was brutally crushed by the British. Thousands of Palestinians were killed, homes were demolished, and entire communities were disarmed. Meanwhile, global Jewish immigration surged, especially as Jews fled Nazi Europe. By the late 1930s, Jews made up around 30% of Palestine's population. Zionist paramilitaries like the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi grew in power. The Holocaust intensified calls for a Jewish state. Zionist leaders lobbied Britain and the United States to open Palestine to survivors. Palestinians opposed the idea, believing it would lead to permanent displacement. In 1947, the United Nations proposed partitioning Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem under international control. Jews accepted the plan. Palestinians and Arab states rejected it, viewing it as colonial theft. At the time, Jews owned less than 7% of the land, but were allocated over half of it. Civil war broke out between Jewish and Arab militias before the British even left. Violence spread across cities like Jaffa, Haifa, and Jerusalem. The foundations of the modern conflict had been laid. 2 peoples, 2 visions, 1 land. On May 14, 1948, as the British withdrew, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The following day, 5 Arab states invaded, marking the beginning of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. For Israelis, this was a war of independence. For Palestinians, it marked the Nakba, the catastrophe. During the fighting, over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled their homes. More than 400 towns and villages were depopulated, many permanently destroyed. Israel emerged victorious and expanded its territory to 78% of historic Palestine, more than what the UN partition plan had proposed. Jordan annexed the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Egypt took control of Gaza. No Palestinian state was created. Refugees were barred from returning. Israel passed laws seizing abandoned Palestinian land. Camps filled with displaced families appeared across Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Gaza, many of which still exist today. Inside Israel, around 150,000 Palestinians remained. They were placed under martial law until 1966, denied basic civil rights. In 1956, Israel invaded Egypt during the Suez Crisis with Britain and France. Though militarily successful, international pressure forced a withdrawal. The conflict remained unresolved. Arab states refused to recognize Israel. Palestinian refugees remained stateless. Armed groups began forming with the aim of reclaiming lost land. But the next major turning point came in 1967, during the Six-Day War. In June 1967, Israel launched a preemptive war against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. In just 6 days, it captured the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, and Sinai Peninsula. The occupation of Palestinian territories began and continues to this day. The United Nations passed Resolution 242, calling for Israel's withdrawal from occupied territories in exchange for peace, but that never fully materialized. In the years that followed, Israel built settlements across the West Bank and East Jerusalem, considered illegal under international law. Palestinians lived under military rule, subject to curfews, home demolitions, checkpoints, and land confiscations. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, became the main voice of Palestinian nationalism. Though initially focused on armed struggle, the PLO gradually gained international legitimacy and observer status at the UN. In 1987, after decades of occupation and growing despair, the First Intifada erupted. This was a mass, largely unarmed uprising. Palestinians boycotted Israeli goods, staged demonstrations, and refused to cooperate with occupation authorities. The Israeli military responded with force, rubber bullets, live ammunition, and mass arrests. The world began to see the human cost of occupation more clearly. The First Intifada eventually led to negotiations. In 1993, after secret talks in Oslo, Norway, the PLO and Israel signed the Oslo Accords. It was a moment of hope, mutual recognition, and the promise of a two-state solution. But Oslo left major issues unresolved: settlements, refugees, Jerusalem, and borders. And as the years passed, the peace process began to unravel. In 2000, peace talks collapsed at Camp David. No agreement was reached on core issues, especially the fate of Jerusalem, refugees, and settlements. Days later, Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon visited the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. The move was seen as a provocation. Protests erupted. The Second Intifada began. This uprising was far more violent than the first. Palestinian groups launched suicide bombings. Israel reoccupied much of the West Bank, destroyed infrastructure, and built the separation barrier. Thousands of civilians died on both sides. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, removing settlers but maintaining control of airspace, borders, and access. A year later, Hamas won elections. After a brief civil conflict with Fatah, Hamas took control of Gaza. Israel and Egypt imposed a blockade, severely limiting movement and goods. Electricity, medicine, building materials, all restricted. Gaza became an open-air prison. Periodic wars erupted in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, and 2021. Meanwhile, settlement expansion in the West Bank accelerated. Over 700,000 Israelis now live beyond the 1967 Green Line. The Palestinian Authority lost credibility. Peace talks froze. The idea of a two-state solution faded. A younger generation of Palestinians grew up knowing only checkpoints, sieges, and military raids. In Israel, public opinion shifted rightward. Leaders vowed never to give up full control of Jerusalem or remove major settlements. Hamas, despite international isolation, remained in power. Rockets and airstrikes became routine. Casualties mounted. The status quo held, but only barely. Then came 2023. In October 2023, Hamas launched an unprecedented attack on Israeli territory, killing civilians and taking hostages. It was the deadliest day in Israel's history. The response was immediate and devastating. Israel launched a massive military campaign in Gaza. Entire neighborhoods were leveled. Hospitals, schools, and refugee camps were bombed. Thousands of Palestinians were killed, including children. Water and electricity were cut off. Humanitarian agencies warned of famine and mass displacement. For Israelis, it was a moment of national trauma. For Palestinians, it was yet another chapter in a long history of collective punishment. The world reacted with protest and polarization. Western governments largely supported Israel's right to defend itself. Much of the global South condemned the siege and called for a ceasefire. On college campuses and in the streets, people took sides. Yet at the core of the crisis were the same unresolved issues: occupation, statelessness, security, and human rights. The conflict had entered a new, bloodier phase, but its roots were old. Today, most Palestinians still live under occupation, in exile, or behind blockades. Most Israelis still live with the fear of rockets, war, and regional isolation. Trust is shattered. Extremism grows. The peace process is dead. But the fight for justice continues, in courtrooms, protests, and international forums. Activists, survivors, scholars, and ordinary people are still trying to imagine a future where both peoples can live in dignity. This is not just a regional conflict. It's a test of humanity's ability to resolve injustice without domination. The outcome is not yet written, but history demands that we understand how we got here. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more deep dives into the world's incredible histories.